The rain did not simply fall in Blackwood Heights, it was driven like cold iron nails into the slick black asphalt by a relentless, howling wind. It was the kind of coastal squall that stripped the autumn leaves from the ancient oaks and plastered them against the wrought iron gates of the estates, turning the exclusive American suburb into a drowned, Gothic landscape. Elias Thorne stood on the rear running board of the 20-ton Mack sanitation truck, his gloved hands gripping the freezing steel railing as the hydraulic brakes hissed and groaned. The amber strobe lights atop the cab cut through the deluge, painting the manicured lawns and towering stone facades in rhythmic, jaundiced flashes. At 48, Elias was a ghost in a high-visibility vest. He had spent 2 decades clinging to the back of these roaring, diesel-breathing beasts, learning a singular, undeniable truth: the city only knew you by what you threw away. To the people inside those warm, glowing mansions, he was not a man. He was a mechanical extension of the truck, an invisible entity designed to whisk away the filthy consequences of their excess. "Next stop is the Vance estate," yelled Sarah Jenkins, her voice barely piercing the roar of the engine and the thunder. She was hanging off the opposite side of the hopper, a 24-year-old rookie whose bright yellow rain gear was already failing to keep out the chill. Sarah was sharp, a journalism grad paying off crippling student loans the hard way because no paper was hiring. She hadn't yet acquired Elias's stoic immunity to the indignities of the midnight shift. She still glared when the luxury sedans refused to yield, she still muttered curses when the rich left broken glass loose in thin plastic. "I know," Elias shouted back, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Watch your footing. The cobblestones are slick." The truck lumbered forward, its massive tires churning the flooded gutters, until it arrived at the towering, bronze-gilded gates of Marcus Vance. Vance was a titan of private equity, a CEO whose ruthless corporate acquisitions were frequently celebrated on the covers of glossy financial magazines. His estate, a sprawling neoclassic fortress of imported limestone, sat at the absolute apex of the Blackwood Heights hill. Tonight, despite the torrential storm, every arched window on the ground floor blazed with golden light. A line of chauffeured Mercedes and Bentleys idled in the circular driveway, exhaust plumes curling into the violent rain. Vance was hosting one of his infamous midnight gatherings. As the sanitation truck backed slowly into the service alcove, its reverse alarm piercing the stormy night, a pair of heavy wooden doors on the mansion's side portico swung open. The muffled, heavy bass of a jazz quartet spilled out into the cold air. 3 men in bespoke tuxedos stepped out onto the covered veranda to smoke, shielding their cigars from the wind. Among them was Marcus Vance himself. Elias recognized the sharp, hawkish profile, the silver hair perfectly styled despite the humidity, and the casual, predatory stance. Vance held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, laughing at something one of his sycophants had said. As Elias and Sarah leapt from the running boards, their heavy rubber boots splashing into an ankle-deep puddle of freezing water, Vance's gaze drifted toward them. The CEO's smile didn't fade, but his eyes flattened with aristocratic disdain. He raised a hand, gesturing vaguely toward the truck with his cigar. "Look at that," one of the guests laughed, his voice carrying over the wind. "The phantom collectors arrive. Right on time to clear the stench." "Hardly phantom," Vance drawled, his voice a rich, resonant baritone dripping with condescension. "They make enough noise to wake the dead. God knows what we pay property taxes for if we have to look at them." Sarah's jaw tightened. She hoisted a heavy, sodden bag of refuse, her knuckles white with rage. "I'd love to throw this right at his smug, perfectly shaved face," she muttered to Elias, tossing the bag into the truck's hopper. "Ignore them, Sarah," Elias said quietly, his face an unreadable mask beneath the dripping brim of his hood. "They don't see us. They never have. We're just the help. Get the bags from the enclosure." Elias moved with practiced, rhythmic efficiency. He approached the brick-lined refuse enclosure tucked behind a meticulously trimmed hedge. Inside sat 4 oversized, heavy-duty black contractor bags. They were oddly dense, lacking the squishy, asymmetrical give of normal household trash. Elias grabbed the knotted neck of the first bag. It weighed a solid 40 pounds, shifting with a bizarre, uniform density. Heavy night for Vance, Elias grunted, dragging two of the bags toward the truck's yawning hydraulic maw. Probably the bones of his last corporate takeover, Sarah snapped, dragging the other two. Elias hoisted the first bag, swinging it in a pendulum motion to clear the high lip of the hopper. But as the heavy plastic cleared the edge, the wind caught it, pushing it sideways. The bottom of the bag snagged violently on a jagged, rusted flange protruding from the compactor's safety guard. With a sickening riot, the thick plastic tore open from end to end. Elias braced himself for the usual cascade of rotting food, wet coffee grounds, and discarded luxury packaging. Instead, the torn belly of the bag vomited a massive, blinding cloud of white. It wasn't organic waste. It was paper. Thousands upon thousands of meticulously shredded documents. The wind howled, catching the confetti-like strips and whipping them into a miniature blizzard. The shredded paper exploded outward, coating Elias's chest, sticking to his wet visor, and scattering across the flooded, gleaming cobblestones of Vance's driveway. "Damn it!" Sarah cried, throwing her arms up to shield her face as the white storm engulfed the back of the truck. "What the hell is this?" Elias didn't curse. He froze. The rain immediately began to hammer the shredded paper into a soggy, papier-mâché paste against the asphalt. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the icy water seeping through his heavy trousers. He pulled off his thick right glove, his bare fingers quickly plucking a few of the soaked strips from the puddle before they disintegrated entirely. This wasn't normal home office waste. Elias knew what that looked like, straight-cut ribbons of junk mail and old bills. These were micro-cut shreds, tiny diamond-shaped particles designed by high-security industrial shredders to make reassembly impossible. And yet, by sheer, blind luck, the tear had exposed a clump of paper that had jammed in the shredder's teeth, remaining partially intact. Elias squinted through the driving rain, holding the 2-inch scrap of heavy stock paper under the harsh amber glare of the truck's strobe lights. The water was already making the ink bleed, but the bold red stamp across the top was unmistakable, Doge subpoena, eyes only. Beneath it, partial lines of text remained legible, offshore routing. Cayman. Vance Holdings, immediate destruction required. Elias's breath hitched. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced through the numbing chill of the storm. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the illuminated portico. Marcus Vance was no longer laughing. The CEO had stepped right to the edge of the veranda, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone balustrade. He was staring directly at Elias, the easy arrogance entirely stripped from his face, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. For the first time in 20 years, an elite resident of Blackwood Heights was actually looking at Elias Thorne. Really looking at him. "Elias?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping the sarcastic edge, replaced by a sudden, intuitive caution. She stepped closer, looking down at the scrap of paper in his hand. Is he destroying evidence?" Elias looked at the thousands of white shreds dissolving in the gutters, washing down the storm drains like snowmelt. Panic shredding. Done hastily, dumped in the regular trash to avoid the logging protocols of secure disposal companies. Vance thought the storm and the anonymity of the garbage truck would swallow his sins whole. Elias slowly crushed the wet scrap of paper into his palm, sealing it in a tight fist. He stood up, meeting Marcus Vance's gaze across the torrential downpour. The silence between them was heavier than the storm, a sudden, dangerous cord pulled taut over the roaring diesel engine. "Throw the rest in, Sarah," Elias said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes never leaving the man on the porch. "Hit the compactor. We haven't seen a thing." But as he shoved his bare, clenched fist deep into the waterproof pocket of his coat, Elias knew the truth. The invisible men had just seen everything. The rain did not fall in the city, it accumulated, a heavy, suffocating mist that dragged the smog down to the pavement. Elias Thorne parked the idling 20-ton Mack truck in Bay 4 of the District 9 Sanitation Depot. The air brakes exhaled a long, dying hiss that echoed through the cavernous, corrugated steel garage. The depot smelled the way it always did, a deeply ingrained perfume of diesel exhaust, rotting citrus, rust, and the metallic tang of ozone. But tonight, Elias barely noticed the stench. His pulse was hammering a frantic rhythm against his collarbone. He killed the engine and grabbed the heavy-duty black trash bag from the passenger seat. It wasn't a standard city bag. It was thick, industrial polyurethane, the kind used for hazardous materials or, in this case, a desperate cover-up. He tucked it under his heavy canvas coat, shielding it from the depot's flickering fluorescent lights, and made his way across the grease-slicked concrete toward the dispatch office. Inside the glass-walled booth, Sarah Jenkins sat bathed in the pale blue glow of 3 CRT monitors. She was 35 but had the exhausted, sharp-edged posture of someone a decade older, a byproduct of working the graveyard shift in a city that produced more garbage than it did hope. A half-smoked cigarette smoldered in a ceramic mug that doubled as an ashtray, a lukewarm cup of black coffee sat perilously close to her keyboard. Elias pushed the heavy door open. It squealed on unoiled hinges. Sarah didn't look up from her routing matrix. "You're late, Thorne. Route 43 was supposed to be clocked out 20 minutes ago. Don't tell me you blew another hydraulic line on the compactor." "Lock the door, Sarah," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. That made her look up. Her fingers paused over the keys. She studied his face, the hollowed cheeks, the rainwater dripping from his graying beard, the wide, bloodshot eyes. She didn't ask questions. She reached under the desk and hit the magnetic lock. A heavy clunk sealed them inside the 10x10 booth. "What did you do, Elias?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Tell me you didn't hit a pedestrian." "Nothing like that." Elias moved to the small folding table in the corner, sweeping a stack of outdated union newsletters onto the linoleum floor. He dropped the black bag onto the table. It landed with a wet, heavy thud. "I found something. Or rather, they tried to make sure I didn't find it." Sarah stood up, crossing her arms over her faded flannel shirt. "Who is they?" "The suit's up in the heights." Elias pulled back the plastic, revealing a damp, mangled clump of shredded paper. It looked like papier-mâché that had been dragged through a gutter. "They dumped this in a civilian bin. High-grade crosscut. But the bin was overflowing, and the lid was open. The rain got to it. It jammed the shredder blades, left half of it in long strips." Sarah stared at the sodden mess. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You brought me a bag of wet confetti. Elias, I'm a dispatcher, not a forensic scientist. Throw it in the incinerator." "Look at the paper, Sarah. Just look at it." She hesitated, then stepped closer. She picked up a pair of tweezers she used for fixing the jammed timecard machine and gingerly pulled a single, damp strip from the mass. She held it up to the harsh desk lamp. The paper wasn't standard printer stock. It was thick, infused with a faint metallic thread. Watermarks glowed faintly under the light. "Department of Defense," she breathed, the color draining from her face. "Elias, this is SCF-level paper. If you're caught with this, they don't just fire you. They disappear you." "I know," he said grimly. "That's why we need to know what's on it. Someone threw this out in a panic. I saw a black SUV tearing out of the alley just as I pulled up. They didn't stick around to make sure the burn bag was actually destroyed. We need to piece it together." Sarah looked from the pile to Elias. The safe, smart play was to toss it. But Sarah had spent her life watching the city's wealthy elite throw away things of value, treating the world below them as an invisible dumping ground. A spark of defiance lit in her dark eyes. "Grab the clear packing tape," she ordered, pulling up a secondary desk lamp. "And paper towels. Gently. If you rub it, the ink will bleed." For the next hour, the dispatch booth became a makeshift laboratory. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the monitors and the soft snick of the tape dispenser. It was maddening work. The wet strips clung to their calloused fingers. Every piece was a puzzle in the dirt, a fragmented glimpse into a world of power and consequence. Elias found a corner piece with a red classification stamp, top secret/no-forn. Sarah found a cluster of strips that formed a complex geometric diagram, a lattice of wires and propulsion thrusters. "It's a schematic," Sarah murmured, meticulously aligning a torn edge. "Aerospace. Looks like a guidance system. Why would a city contractor have DoD guidance schematics?" Elias asked, gently dabbing a soggy strip with a paper towel. Before Sarah could answer, a blinding beam of light swept across the frosted glass of the dispatch booth. Elias froze. Outside, the low, powerful purr of an engine cut through the ambient noise of the depot. It wasn't the rumbling diesel of a garbage truck. It was the whisper-quiet idle of a luxury sedan. "Cover it," Elias hissed. Sarah moved with lightning speed, grabbing a stack of oversized sanitation route maps and throwing them over the taped-together documents. She shoved the remaining wet shreds back into the black bag and kicked it under the desk. Elias grabbed a clipboard and pretended to fill out a maintenance log. Heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete. The doorknob rattled. Finding it locked, the visitor knocked, 3 sharp, authoritative raps. Sarah took a deep breath, smoothing her expression into one of bored irritation. She hit the release button. The door swung open, bringing with it the sharp, incongruous scent of vetiver and expensive tailoring. Marcus Vance stepped into the booth. He was a man who looked like he had never sweated a day in his life. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His eyes, however, were dead and black, scanning the small room with the predatory calculation of a shark in shallow water. Vance was the city's chief liaison for municipal contracts, but rumor had it his real job was making problems disappear for the mayor's office and their corporate backers. "Mr. Vance," Sarah said, feigning surprise. "Bit late for a depot inspection, isn't it?" Vance didn't smile. He looked at Elias, then at the clipboard. "Thorne. You were on Route 43 tonight. The Heights." "Yes, sir," Elias said, keeping his voice perfectly level. "Finished an hour ago." "Did you?" Vance stepped closer, his polished leather shoes squeaking faintly on the damp linoleum. "There was a report of a missed collection at the Vanguard Energy Building. A specific secure bin." "I hit every bin on the manifest," Elias replied, meeting Vance's dead eyes. "If it wasn't on the curb, it didn't get collected. You know the union rules." Vance's gaze lingered on Elias's damp coat, then drifted to the desk. He reached out, his manicured fingers brushing the edge of the oversized route maps Sarah had thrown down. Elias's heart stopped. Beneath that map was a felony charge and a death sentence. "Sanitation is a vital function of our city," Vance said softly, his fingers tapping the map. "You men and women are the invisible blood cells keeping the organism clean. But occasionally, a cell absorbs something toxic. Something it shouldn't have touched. And the body has to purge it." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you found something unusual tonight, Thorne, you bring it to me. Not your supervisor. Me. Do we understand each other?" "I just collect the trash, Mr. Vance," Elias said. "Nothing unusual about that." Vance stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Finally, the corner of his mouth twitched. "Good. Keep up the good work." He turned and walked out. The door clicked shut. They listened as his footsteps faded, followed by the purr of the sedan driving away. Sarah let out a breath she sounded like she had been holding for a year. Her hands were shaking as she reached into her desk, pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes, and lit one, taking a deep drag. He knows, she said, smoke spilling from her lips. He doesn't know for sure if you have it, but he knows. Which means we don't have much time, Elias said, pulling the maps away. They returned to the puzzle, the adrenaline now burning hot in their veins. The fear focused them. Strips of paper slid into place. Tape locked them down. The picture became clearer, and with it, the magnitude of the horror. It wasn't just a schematic. Sarah matched a cluster of text to the bottom of the diagram. She read the assembled paragraph aloud, her voice trembling. Project Cold Star. Hypersonic glide trajectory codes. Transfer authorized by. She paused, finding the last missing piece of the signature block. She slotted it in. Elias leaned over her shoulder, reading the name. Marcus Vance. Next to the signature was a routing number for an offshore bank, and correspondence referencing a buyer in a foreign intelligence directorate. Elias stood back, wiping the grime and sweat from his forehead. The grim sanitation depot felt smaller now, a fragile bubble ready to burst. The air was thick with the weight of the treason laid out on the cheap folding table. Vance wasn't just corrupt, he was selling the nation's most classified defense grids to the highest bidder, and he was using the city's municipal waste system as a blind drop. They're going to kill us, Elias, Sarah whispered, staring at the puzzle in the dirt. Only if they can find us, Elias replied, reaching for the taped documents. He carefully folded them and tucked them inside his jacket, right over his heart. The invisible men had finally seen too much, and there was no going back to the shadows. Pack a bag, Sarah, he said, turning toward the rainy night outside. We need to disappear. 80 floors above the bruised asphalt of Manhattan, the air inside Marcus Vance's penthouse office tasted of filtered ozone and absolute control. The storm raging outside was reduced to a silent film of rain washing down the floor-to-ceiling glass, a mere inconvenience happening to lesser people. Vance stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the impeccable tailoring of his midnight blue suit unwrinkled. He stared down at the sprawling grid of the financial district, viewing the city not as a living organism, but as a balance sheet. And tonight, there was a glaring discrepancy. Explain to me, Vance said, his voice a soft, terrifying purr, how a grade A disposal protocol fails. I don't want excuses, Mr. Cross. I want the anatomy of the failure. Behind him, Cross, the chief of Vance Vanguard's private security apparatus, shifted his weight on the imported Persian rug. It wasn't a systemic failure, sir. It was a human variable. The sub-basement cameras at the Broad Street property show the red-tagged bag never made it to the private incinerator. The municipal pickup arrived 4 minutes early. One of the sanitation workers bypassed the standard bins. He took the red tag. Vance slowly turned away from the window. His eyes, the color of winter ice, locked onto his fixer. The bag containing the unredacted ledgers for the Cayman accounts. The bag that connects this tower to the shell companies. You are telling me a garbage man simply walked off with it? We believe he noticed the weight of the hard drives, sir. Or the unbroken wax seals. These scavengers, they look for electronics to pawn. It was likely opportunistic. I do not deal in likely, Cross, Vance whispered, stepping closer. The faint scent of his bergamot cologne seemed to drop the temperature in the room. That bag is the thread that unravels a $10 billion empire. You will find that truck. You will find that man. And you will ensure that the only thing he recycles is his own breath. Am I understood? The intercept teams are already deployed, Mr. Vance. We're tracking the truck's municipal GPS. Do not come back to this office until you have my shadows back in the dark, Vance said, turning back to the window. Down in the concrete canyons, the rain did not fall silently. It hammered against the rusted steel roof of Elias Thorne's 20-ton Mack compactor like a barrage of artillery. Elias hauled a sodden canvas bag over his shoulder, his boots splashing through a puddle shimmering with a rainbow slick of motor oil. The financial district at 3 in the morning was a ghost town of towering monoliths, its alleys a labyrinth of steam vents, loading docks, and secrets. To the men in the high-rises, Elias was just a high-vis vest and a bad smell, an invisible man. That invisibility was his greatest weapon. "Elias, you need to pick up the pace." Sarah Jenkins's voice crackled in his right ear, warped by the static of the storm and the cheap Bluetooth headset he wore beneath his woolen beanie. Sitting in the warmth of her chaotic apartment in Queens, surrounded by the decoded fragments of the documents Elias had smuggled to her 2 nights ago, she was his overwatch. "I'm moving, Sarah," Elias grunted, tossing the bag into the truck's yawning hopper. He reached for the hydraulic lever, pulling it down. The truck roared, the steel teeth of the compactor descending to crush the refuse. But there's a pattern to the Broad Street route. If I skip bins, the depot supervisor gets flagged. If I act differently, they'll know I'm onto them. "They already know, Elias," Sarah fired back, the rapid clacking of her mechanical keyboard bleeding through the mic. "I'm tapped into the Department of Sanitation's dispatch grid. Somebody is pinging your truck's transponder. It's not the city. It's an encrypted IP. Vance's people are hunting you." A cold knot tightened in Elias's stomach, distinct from the damp chill of the rain. He wiped a mixture of sweat and precipitation from his brow, his eyes darting toward the mouth of the alley. "How long?" "They're sweeping the grid block by block." 2 black SUVs just blew through a red light at Wall and Water Street. "They're maybe 3 minutes out." "I need the rest of the drop," Elias said, his jaw setting. He marched toward the deep shadows of the loading dock at the rear of the Vance Vanguard Annex. The puzzle pieces from Tuesday showed they were dumping the physical drives in sequence. "Bag 2 is in this dumpster. If I leave without it, we only have half the ledger. We can't prove the embezzlement without the encryption keys." "Elias, don't be an idiot. Evidence doesn't matter if you're dead. Get in the truck and drive." 3 minutes is an eternity, Sarah." Elias hoisted himself over the lip of the massive green commercial dumpster. The smell hit him instantly, a pungent wave of rotting coffee grounds, wet cardboard, and the metallic tang of printer toner. He clicked on his headlamp, a narrow beam of white light cutting through the gloom. He plunged his heavily gloved hands into the belly of the beast, tearing through black plastic bags. He moved with frantic precision. He knew the anatomy of corporate trash. He ignored the light bags filled with breakroom waste and bypassed the heavy, clinking bags of glass bottles. He was looking for dense, squared-off shapes. The secure disposal bags. Rain lashed at his back. 2 minutes, Elias. They just turned onto your avenue. Come on, Elias muttered, his fingers ripping through a thick layer of shredded paper. It felt like digging through snow. Finally, his heavy canvas glove brushed against something rigid. A thick, red-tagged polyurethane bag. He yanked it free. It was heavy. Perfect. Suddenly, the alley walls lit up. Blinding, halogen headlights washed the brickwork in harsh white light. The deep, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine echoed off the narrow walls. Elias. They're at the mouth of the alley. Sarah practically screamed in his ear. Elias killed his headlamp instantly. He threw the heavy red bag over the side of the dumpster, letting it drop into the narrow gap between the steel bin and the brick wall. But there was no time for him to climb out. The glare of the headlights was already sweeping across the top of the dumpster. He sank. Elias buried himself in the refuse, pulling a massive sheet of sodden, corrugated cardboard over his head just as the SUV's doors slammed shut. Footsteps. Heavy, synchronized, and splashing through the puddles. Not the shuffling walk of the homeless, nor the hurried step of a late-night commuter. These were the measured, predatory strides of Vance's fixers. Check the cab, a deep voice commanded over the idle of the truck. See if the keys are in it. Elias held his breath. The stench of the garbage around him was suffocating, a cocktail of decay pressing against his face. A rogue trickle of mystery fluid seeped through the shoulder of his jacket, cold and vile. He didn't flinch. He became part of the trash. "Cab's empty," a second voice called out. "Check the back. Check the bins." The crunch of expensive boots on gravel grew louder, stopping inches from the steel wall of Elias's dumpster. A beam from a tactical flashlight sliced through the crack between the cardboard and the rim of the bin, illuminating the floating dust and steam. Elias closed his eyes. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently he was certain the men could hear it. He slipped his right hand toward the heavy steel pry bar he kept in his utility belt. If they looked under the cardboard, he would have one swing. Just one. "Hey!" The first voice barked. "Look at the hydraulic press. The hopper is still cycling." The footsteps retreated slightly. The rhythmic, agonizing whine of the compactor on the back of Elias's truck was still grinding away, crushing the first load he had thrown in. "He's on foot," the fixer concluded. "Probably went down the steam tunnels at the end of the block when he saw our headlights. Leave the truck. Let's flush him out." Doors slammed. The heavy engine of the SUV roared, tires peeling against the wet asphalt as it reversed out of the alley, leaving the garbage truck behind. For a long minute, Elias didn't move. He lay in the filth, listening only to the rain and the idling of his own truck. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed the cardboard aside and peeked over the rusted rim of the dumpster. The alley was empty. He scrambled over the side, dropping to the wet pavement, gasping for the cold night air. He reached into the gap between the wall and retrieved the red-tagged bag, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline. "Sarah," Elias breathed, tapping his earpiece. "I'm clear. I have the second half." A heavy sigh of relief crackled back. "You're insane, Thorne. Get out of there. Now." "They'll realize I'm not in the tunnels soon," Elias said, marching back to the cab of his truck and throwing the bag onto the passenger seat. He climbed in, the warmth of the heater a stark contrast to the freezing terror of the alley. "Vance knows his armor has a crack. And he just sent his shadow to kill me." Elias threw the truck into gear, the massive air brakes hissing as he pulled out into the storm. The invisible man was invisible no longer, the hunt had begun. The rain hammered against the corrugated aluminum roof of the salvage depot, a relentless, drumming rhythm that did nothing to drown out the low, anxious hum of the optical scanner. Elias Thorne leaned over the plywood table, his knuckles white as he braced his weight against the wood. Beneath the harsh, flickering glare of a solitary halogen bulb, a jigsaw puzzle of damnation was slowly coming together. They had spent 48 hours sifting through the grime and the rot, pulling these specific, micro-cut shreds of paper from the belly of a municipal garbage truck. To anyone else, it was confetti. To the phantom collectors, it was the anatomy of a murder. Sarah Jenkins sat in front of her dual monitors, her face bathed in the ghostly blue light of the screens. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, running a proprietary algorithm that stitched the scanned paper fragments into a cohesive digital image. Her eyes, ringed with the bruised purple of exhaustion, darted back and forth as the text materialized line by agonizing line. "The cipher is breaking," Sarah murmured, her voice raspy from too much stale coffee and too little sleep. The crosscut was standard industrial, but whoever shredded this was in a panic. They fed the pages in at an angle. It gave the software enough margin overlap to rebuild the letterheads. Elias leaned closer, his breath fogging the edge of the monitor. "Give me a name, Sarah." Who was so terrified of the CEO that they tried to erase their own existence before vanishing? Sarah tapped the enter key. The mosaic of jagged white shapes on the screen snapped into a locked grid. A high-resolution scan of a heavily redacted ledger appeared, and at the top, bold and undeniable, was a seal. Not a corporate logo, but the stoic, eagle-crested emblem of the United States federal government. Beneath it rested a signature block, Arthur Pendleton, Senior Auditor, Department of Defense. The temperature in the drafty depot seemed to plummet. Elias felt a cold bead of sweat track down his spine. Arthur Pendleton, Elias whispered, the syllables tasting like ash in his mouth. The whistleblower. The one who jumped off the George Washington Bridge 3 weeks ago, Sarah confirmed, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. The news cycle chewed on it for 2 days. They said he was suffering from clinical depression. Left his car idling on the shoulder, a folded note on the dashboard. They never found the body. Because he never jumped, Elias said, his mind racing, connecting the puzzles in the dirt to the CEO's shadow operations they had uncovered days prior. Pendleton was looking into the offshore logistics accounts. He found the missing billions. The ghost shipments. The CEO didn't just fire him. He had him erased. And this, Elias gestured to the table covered in physical shreds of paper, this was Pendleton's insurance policy. The audit he tried to hide before they got to him. The implications were suffocating. They weren't just holding evidence of corporate embezzlement anymore, they were holding a dead man's final scream. They were holding treason. The heavy steel door at the far end of the sorting floor shuddered, groaning on its rusted hinges. Marcus Vance stepped into the gloom, water cascading from the brim of his waxed canvas coat. The veteran depot manager didn't usually spook, but tonight, his jaw was set like a steel trap, and his dark eyes were wide with an urgency Elias had never seen before. "Kill the screens," Marcus ordered, his voice a low, gravelly bark that echoed through the cavernous space. "Now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed her palm against the power strip under the desk, plunging their corner of the depot into suffocating darkness. "What is it?" Elias asked, moving instinctively toward the shadows of a compacted cardboard bale. "We've got company at the front gate," Marcus said, pulling a heavy, matte black Glock 19 from the holster beneath his coat. He checked the chamber in the dim ambient light filtering through the high, grime-caked windows. 4 black SUVs just rolled past the outer perimeter. No headlights. "Cops?" Sarah asked, hurriedly stuffing the physical paper shreds into a waterproof canvas satchel. "They announced themselves over the intercom as the Department of Public Health," Marcus said, a bitter, humorless smile twisting his scarred face. "Said they're here for an unannounced midnight inspection of our sanitation protocols." Elias crept toward the catwalk stairs and peered through the streaked glass of the observation window overlooking the yard. The rain was coming down in sheets, but illuminated by the sporadic flashes of lightning, he saw them. A dozen men fanning out across the muddy asphalt. They wore dark windbreakers with Health Inspector printed in bold yellow letters across the back, but there was nothing bureaucratic about them. They moved with predatory geometry. Crisp, practiced, lethal. They communicated with silent hand signals. And beneath the nylon of their windbreakers, Elias saw the unmistakable, rigid outlines of plate carriers and the elongated barrels of suppressed submachine guns. "They aren't health inspectors," Elias said, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "They're mercenaries. The CEO sent them to finish cleaning up Pendleton's mess." "And we're the mess," Marcus growled. A muffled, rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip pierced the ambient noise of the storm. The heavy deadbolt on the depot's main loading bay door sparked violently, the metal turning molten orange for a fraction of a second before blowing inward with a deafening screech. The mercenaries were using breaching charges. "Move!" Marcus hissed, shoving Elias and Sarah toward the labyrinth of the sorting floor. The depot was a cathedral of discarded things, a maze of towering bales of crushed plastic, rusted car chassis, and mountains of bundled newspapers. It was an archivist's sanctuary, but tonight, it was going to be a hunting ground. Elias grabbed the canvas satchel, the weight of Pendleton's ghost heavy in his grip, and sprinted behind Sarah. They dove into the narrow, foul-smelling chasm between 2 stacks of compacted aluminum cans just as the loading bay doors were wrenched upward. The mercenaries flooded the floor in perfect synchronization. Flashlight beams, blindingly white and sharp as scalpels, sliced through the dusty air. Spread out. Thermal optics on, a cold, synthesized voice crackled over a tactical radio. Find the paper pushers. Secure the documents. Burn the rest of the facility to the slag. Elias pressed his back against the jagged aluminum bales, the sharp edges of crushed soda cans biting through his jacket. He clamped a hand over his mouth to muffle the sound of his own ragged breathing. The smell of ozone and wet earth was suddenly overpowered by the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. Boot steps echoed on the concrete. Slow. Methodical. The squelch of wet rubber inching closer to their aisle. Sarah looked at Elias, her eyes wide with terror in the dark, her hand trembling as she clutched a heavy steel wrench she had scooped up from a workbench. Elias shook his head infinitesimally. A wrench wouldn't stop body armor and hollow-point rounds. A beam of light swept the floor inches from Elias's boots. The mercenary was breathing steadily, heavily, just on the other side of the bale. Elias could hear the slight rustle of the man's tactical vest shifting. He closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable shout, the blinding light, the muzzle flash. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from the opposite side of the warehouse. A towering stack of empty shipping containers groaned and collapsed, sending tons of corrugated steel crashing onto the concrete floor with the force of an earthquake. Contact. West wall, a mercenary shouted. The boot steps near Elias spun and sprinted toward the noise. Marcus. He had drawn them off. Now, Elias whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm. To the storm drains. They broke from their cover, sliding through the oily puddles of the depot floor. Every shadow felt like a sniper, every flash of lightning a spotlight. Elias gripped the satchel tighter, the paper shreds inside feeling less like evidence and more like a radioactive core. Arthur Pendleton had died to bring these numbers to the light, and Elias knew with absolute, chilling certainty that if they didn't make it out of this warehouse alive, the whistleblower's ghost would be buried here in the dirt, invisible forever. They reached the heavy iron grate of the drainage tunnel at the back of the facility. As Elias strained to lift the rusted iron, the unmistakable hiss of a suppressed weapon tore through the air, and a bullet shattered the concrete mere inches from his hand, spraying his cheek with sharp, stinging dust. They had been seen. The sky above the city didn't just rain, it collapsed. Water fell in thick, freezing sheets, transforming the asphalt of the industrial district into a slick, mirroring canvas of distorted street lamps and strobing neon. Elias Thorne's lungs burned, each breath tasting of ozone, wet rust, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Beside him, Sarah Jenkins stumbled, her boots slipping on the oil-slicked tarmac. Elias caught her by the elbow before her knees could strike the ground, hauling her upright with a grunt. Keep moving, Elias shouted over the deafening roar of the storm, his voice barely a rasp. We're almost there. Sarah nodded, her face pale and plastered with soaked strands of dark hair. She clutched her waterproof satchel to her chest like a shield. Inside it rested the encrypted drive, the digital ghost of a whistleblower's life, detailing the sprawling, blood-soaked embezzlement empire of Marcus Vance. A sharp, unnatural thwack cut through the rhythm of the rain. A chunk of brick exploded from the alley wall inches from Elias's head, showering his cheek with abrasive dust. Suppressed gunfire. Vance's men were closing the gap. Elias shoved Sarah around the corner, his boots skidding as he pivoted into the narrow, chain-link corridor that served as the rear approach to the Apex Waste Reclamation Facility, Sector 4. This was Elias's domain. For a decade, he had navigated the belly of this beast, hauling the city's discarded secrets. Vance's hitmen might have owned the pristine corporate boardrooms and the high-tech surveillance grids, but down here, in the rotting, mechanical bowels of the city, they were trespassers. Elias drew a heavy set of bolt cutters from behind a rusted dumpster, a stash he'd kept for emergencies, and snapped the padlock on the facility's perimeter gate. He threw his weight against the iron grating, pushing it open just enough for Sarah to squeeze through, then followed, pulling it shut and wrapping a thick length of heavy-gauge chain around the bars. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy them minutes. "Into the sorting bay," Elias ordered, pointing toward a monolithic corrugated steel structure that loomed in the dark like a dormant titan. They sprinted across the loading yard, weaving between towering, sodden mountains of compressed cardboard and jagged pyramids of scrap metal. The smell hit them in waves, a pungent, suffocating cocktail of decaying organic matter, stagnant water, and sharp industrial solvents. It was a stench that made Sarah gag, but to Elias, it was the smell of home turf advantage. They slipped through a rusted side door into the cavernous interior of the sorting facility. The drumming of the rain on the tin roof was magnified tenfold in here, an oppressive, echoing percussion. The air was thick with humidity and dust. Amber security lights cast long, skeletal shadows across the dormant machinery, miles of conveyor belts, massive magnetic separators, and the towering hydraulic presses of the trash compactors. "Hide behind the secondary crusher," Elias whispered, guiding Sarah toward a massive iron bulkhead dripping with black grease. "Do not move, no matter what you hear. If I don't come back in 10 minutes, you take the underground maintenance tunnel. It leads to the storm drains. You run, and you publish that data." Sarah grabbed his forearm, her grip surprisingly strong. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but resolute. "You are not dying in a garbage dump for me, Elias." "I'm not dying tonight," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register. "I know this place." "They don't." Elias slipped away into the shadows just as the heavy metal door at the front of the facility groaned open. Through the labyrinth of steel grates and sorting chutes, Elias watched them enter. 4 of them. They moved with terrifying, fluid precision, wearing matte black tactical gear that seemed to absorb the dim amber light. They wore night vision goggles, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the aisles with lethal discipline. Vance had sent his best. Marcus Vance was a man who preferred his problems to simply evaporate, cleanly and quietly. But he had underestimated the sheer, chaotic friction of the dirt. Elias crept up a metal stairway, his steps silent. He knew which grates creaked and which were reinforced. He reached the elevated catwalk overlooking the primary sorting belt. Below him, the hitmen split into pairs. 2 moved toward the administrative offices, while the other 2, including the team leader, a hulking shadow of a man, advanced down the central aisle toward Sarah's position. It was time to wake the beast. Elias reached the master control panel for Sector A. The lock had been broken for 3 years. He threw the main breaker and slammed his palm onto the emergency override sequence. The facility erupted into life. With a mechanical shriek that shook the concrete foundations, the primary conveyor belts lurched forward. Sirens began to wail, flashing strobe lights painting the cavernous room in blinding, disorienting flashes of crimson and white. The sudden, deafening roar of the grinding gears and hydraulic engines completely negated the hitman's tactical communication. Below, the 2 men in the central aisle froze, ripping off their night vision goggles as the sudden influx of harsh, strobing light blinded them. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from a tool rack and dropped from the catwalk onto a moving mound of unsorted refuse on the belt below. He rode the garbage like a dark phantom, entirely concealed by the moving shadows. As the belt carried him directly over the trailing hitman, Elias launched himself downward. He struck the man like a falling anvil. The hitman's weapon clattered to the grated floor as Elias drove his elbow into the gap between the man's tactical helmet and his Kevlar vest. The mercenary crumpled without a sound, swallowed by the deafening noise of the machinery. Elias snatched the dropped submachine gun, rolling fluidly behind a forklift as the lead hitman spun around, firing blindly into the shadows. Sparks rained down as bullets chewed through the forklift's metal chassis. Elias didn't bother trying to shoot back in a conventional firefight, he was outgunned and outarmored. Instead, he looked at the environment. The lead hitman was backing up, stepping cautiously onto the reinforced pressure plate of the industrial compactor's loading zone, seeking a clear line of sight. Elias aimed the stolen weapon not at the man, but at the pressurized hydraulic line running along the ceiling directly above him, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet severed the reinforced hose. A geyser of highly pressurized, scalding hydraulic fluid erupted downward, dousing the hitman. The man screamed, a sound barely audible over the roaring machinery, as he dropped his weapon and clawed at his burning eyes. Elias vaulted over the forklift, sprinting toward the control console on the floor level. He slammed the red engagement lever. The massive iron walls of the compactor groaned. The hitman, blinded and slipping on the slick, viscous fluid, tried to scramble out of the pit, but the floor angled sharply downward. The walls began to close in with an unstoppable, terrifying lethality. The man pounded against the slick steel, but the relentless pressure of a machine designed to crush automobiles did not care about the tactical superiority of Marcus Vance's elite. Elias turned away before the walls met, shutting off the compactor's sequence just as the man was pinned, trapped and immobilized by the crushing pressure, alive but entirely incapacitated. The wailing sirens masked the sound of Sarah running up behind him. She stared at the trapped, groaning mercenary, then looked at Elias, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "The other two?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They'll be circling back to the noise," Elias said, his chest heaving as he wiped a mixture of sweat and grease from his forehead. He tossed the empty submachine gun onto a pile of damp cardboard. "We have about 2 minutes before they realize their boss is out of the fight. Where do we go?" Elias looked up toward the high, rain-streaked skylights of the facility. The storm outside was still raging, but the air inside felt suddenly stifling, heavy with the weight of what they had just done. Vance had pushed them into the deepest, darkest corner of the city, expecting them to die quietly in the trash. But the trash had teeth. "We stop running," Elias said, his eyes hardening with a cold, absolute resolve. He looked at the waterproof satchel in Sarah's hands. "Vance sent his ghosts into my house. It's time we return the favor. We're going to the glass tower." Sarah swallowed hard, but nodded, her grip tightening on the drive. Together, they slipped out through the subterranean loading bays, stepping back out into the freezing, relentless rain, leaving the howling machinery and the broken hitmen behind them. The hunt was over. The war had begun. The storm had turned the city into a watercolor painting left out in the rain, a bleeding canvas of smeared neon, liquid asphalt, and fractured headlights. Inside the cab of the Department of Sanitation MacLR, the air was thick with the heavy scent of wet wool, stale diesel, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. Elias Thorne gripped the oversized steering wheel, his calloused hands white-knuckled and trembling slightly. The rhythmic thumping of the massive windshield wipers felt like a countdown. Beside him, Sarah Jenkins sat hunched against the passenger door, her soaked trench coat clinging to her shivering frame. In her lap, she cradled a thick, plastic-wrapped bundle as if it were a newborn child. Beneath the layers of heavy-duty garbage bags lay the impossible puzzle they had spent the last 72 hours bleeding over, thousands of shredded documents, meticulously taped back together, strip by agonizing strip. It was the complete financial anatomy of Marcus Vance's shadow empire, dragged out of the literal gutter. 2 blocks, Sarah said, her voice barely rising above the deafening roar of the truck's engine and the relentless drumming of the rain. She checked the glowing screen of the intercepted police scanner resting on the dashboard. "The convoy is moving south down Broadway. They're taking the tactical team back to Federal Plaza. If we don't catch them before they hit the secure perimeter, the local precincts will bury this for Vance by sunrise." "Hold on," Elias grunted, his voice a low rumble. He didn't just drive the 20-ton behemoth of steel and hydraulic sinew, he commanded it. Elias knew the labyrinth of Manhattan's alleys better than the rats, better than the cops, and certainly better than the corporate assassins who had cornered them in the rain just an hour prior. He downshifted, the heavy transmission groaning in protest, and swung the massive garbage truck into a narrow, cobblestone service street. The side mirrors scraped against brick and dumpsters, sending a shower of sparks into the dark, but Elias didn't flinch. They burst out onto the cross street just as the FBI motorcade, a procession of 3 menacing, jet-black Suburbans flanked by unmarked cruisers, approached the intersection. Now or never, Elias breathed. He slammed his heavy steel-toed boot onto the brake pedal and spun the wheel. The pneumatic air brakes hissed like an awakened dragon, a deafening screech that tore through the stormy night. The colossal garbage truck skidded across the slick asphalt, its massive chassis swinging out to form an impenetrable wall of green and white steel directly across the convoy's path. Tires squealed. The sharp scent of burning rubber instantly overpowered the smell of the rain. The lead Suburban stopped mere inches from the side of the garbage truck, its high beams illuminating the battered side of the compactor. Instantly, the street erupted into organized chaos. Red and blue strobe lights painted the falling rain in frantic, violent bursts. The doors of the SUVs flew open, and a dozen federal agents poured out into the deluge, weapons drawn, tactical flashlights piercing the darkness. "Step out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them. Do it now," the muffled, amplified voice of a bullhorn ordered over the storm. Elias looked at Sarah. She offered a tight, terrified, but resolute nod. She clutched the plastic-wrapped binder to her chest. Elias kicked open the heavy door of the cab and stepped out into the freezing downpour. He raised his hands high above his head, the neon-yellow reflective stripes of his sanitation uniform glowing fiercely in the beam of the flashlights. "Don't shoot!" Elias bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass facades of the surrounding skyscrapers. "We are unarmed. We have evidence." Sarah slid out from the passenger side, mirroring his stance, though one arm remained locked around the package. "Agent Corcoran," she screamed into the blinding lights. "Special Agent Thomas Corcoran. I know you're in there." For a tense, suspended moment, the only sound was the heavy drumming of the rain against the steel hoods of the cars. The laser sights of a dozen assault rifles hovered over Elias's chest like a cluster of angry fireflies. Then, a tall figure in a dark windbreaker stepped forward from the barricade of open SUV doors. He lowered his weapon slightly, squinting through the downpour. "Sarah Jenkins?" Corcoran called back, disbelief coloring his rough voice. "You're supposed to be in hiding. There's a warrant out for your arrest." The warrant was bought and paid for by Marcus Vance. Sarah shouted, stepping slowly toward the lead vehicle. Elias moved with her, placing his broad frame subtly between her and the drawn guns. "Everything you've been looking for, the offshore accounts, the bribes to the Port Authority, the hit orders, it's all here." She reached the hood of the lead Suburban and slid the heavy, plastic-wrapped bundle across the slick metal. It stopped right in front of Corcoran. The agent looked at the drenched sanitation worker, then at the disgraced whistleblower, and finally down at the bundle. He holstered his sidearm and drew a tactical knife, slicing open the thick black plastic. Inside, illuminated by his flashlight, was a chaotic, beautiful mosaic of Scotch tape and shredded paper. Signatures. Account numbers. Routing codes. The undeniable, damning truth that Vance thought he had successfully destroyed. Corcoran stared at the meticulous, impossible reconstruction. He looked up at Elias, the rain dripping from the brim of the agent's cap. "Where the hell did you get this?" Elias allowed himself a small, weary smile. "We took out the trash." 3 miles away, high above the grit and grime of the city streets, the world was silent, sterile, and perfectly climate-controlled. Marcus Vance stood in the center of his sprawling penthouse, a glass of 20-year-old Macallan in his hand. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm battering the city below, but up here, the thunder was nothing more than a faint, distant whisper. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played softly from hidden, state-of-the-art speakers. Vance checked his platinum Patek Philippe. 4 a.m. His cleaners should have reported back by now. The loose ends, the rogue garbage man and the annoying little journalist, were supposed to be buried under the foundation of a new development project in Queens. The soft ding of the private elevator made Vance turn, a confident smirk playing on his lips. "It's about time," he murmured, expecting his head of security. The heavy oak doors didn't open, they exploded. Splinters of antique wood flew across the imported Italian marble floors as a heavily armed FBI SWAT team flooded into the foyer. Black boots trampled over million-dollar Persian rugs. The classical music was instantly drowned out by the harsh, overlapping shouts of federal agents securing the perimeter. Vance's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble, the amber liquid pooling like blood. "What is the meaning of this?" Vance roared, his aristocratic composure cracking instantly. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have all your badges by morning. I'll buy the damn bureau." Agent Corcoran stepped through the shattered doorway, his windbreaker still dripping wet from the rain. He walked right up to Vance, boots crunching over the broken crystal of the Scotch glass. "Marcus Vance, you are under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and a dozen other federal charges," Corcoran said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "On what grounds?" Vance spat, his face flushing crimson. "You have nothing. My lawyers will have me out before sunrise." Corcoran didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, clear evidence bag. Inside it was a page of shredded paper, painstakingly taped back together. It was a ledger page, bearing Vance's unmistakable, sprawling signature authorizing the assassination of a port commissioner. Vance's breath caught in his throat. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow, old, and suddenly very small. He stared at the jagged lines of tape as if looking at a ghost. That was destroyed. It was incinerated. It was gone. "You shouldn't have underestimated the people who clean up after you," Corcoran said, nodding to his men. "Cuff him." As the cold steel clicked around the billionaire's wrists, Vance was dragged toward the elevator, his eyes wide, his mind unable to comprehend that his empire of untouchable glass and steel had been brought down by the very refuse he had so carelessly tossed away. Dawn broke over the city, a cold, golden light that pierced through the breaking storm clouds and reflected off the rain-washed streets. The city was waking up. Millions of people were brewing coffee, tying their shoes, completely oblivious to the war that had been fought and won in the dark, wet alleys of their metropolis. Elias Thorne stood on the back step of his garbage truck, the heavy diesel engine humming its familiar, rhythmic vibration through his boots. The rain had stopped, leaving behind an intensely crisp, clean scent in the air. He reached out, his thick gloves grabbing a heavy, black garbage bag from the curb. With a practiced, fluid motion, he swung it up and into the roaring hopper of the truck. He hit the lever, and the heavy hydraulic press descended with a deafening, satisfying crunch, crushing the city's discarded secrets, its waste, its excess. Elias looked down the avenue. The city was beautiful in the morning light. They were just men in reflective vests. They were invisible to the stockbrokers, the politicians, and the CEOs who hurried past them. They were the phantoms of the city, the unseen guardians who carried away the rot so the world could pretend to be clean. Elias slapped the side of the truck twice. The air brakes hissed, and the massive machine rolled forward into the golden light, ready for the next block.